Most corporate executives, says Amy Larkin, want to have it both ways. On the one hand, they want their companies to be treated like people when they use their money to influence elections and shape government policy. On the other hand, they don't want them treated like people when it comes to taking responsibility for their actions. And they seem to think that their fictional universe of balance sheets and income statements is somehow separate from the real world of oceans and beaches and people and trees. Won't do, says Amy Larkin, but she says it from inside the boardroom. You've got to connect the dots and start paying the real costs of your activities. You have to support the long-term well-being of the planet and its inhabitants, or you too will perish. The good news, says Amy, is that I can show you how to turn this ship around. It turns out that corporations are run by people, and some of those people have foresight and conscience, and those are the people she works with. Amy Larkin was the founding director of Greenpeace Solutions. She now heads the consulting firm Nature Means Business, and she's the author of Environmental Debt, The Hidden Costs of a Changing Global Economy.
We are already paying a carbon tax. We just don't know it. We're paying for it in the costs of extreme weather. We're paying for it in the costs of climate change, which are everywhere. Early arrival is extreme weather. And so that's the cost, that's the real cost of carbon. And if you want to say coal is a cheap energy, coal is not a cheap energy. Coal is the cause of mercury and acid rain, so you can't eat fish. Coal is the cause of climate change, so that there are droughts and hurricanes that cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Around the world, there are climate refugees. There are poor people in Africa where the temperature is now 50 degrees on a regular basis, where people used to have to walk 5 miles for water. Now they are walking 10 miles for water, or in the Marshall Islands, where they are losing their land and their agriculture because the ocean is breaching the islands because of climate change. You are already paying a carbon tax. You're just not paying it at the gas pump or for your electricity. This is the accounting that has to change. This is the business model that has to change. Connecting the effects of what we do with the costs of what we do when we do them, not later when it's too late and when there are bad consequences.
And the consequences are occurring elsewhere. Another one of the line from your book that I really thought was terrific was the price of coal is cheap only because it is subsidized by its own victims.
It is subsidized by its own victims. Imagine if you are a miner and you and all your family have lung diseases, congestive heart failure, your kids have developmental disabilities, you're in a boom and bust cycle, your farmland around you is no longer arable, your water is not good, you are subject to huge spills, not to mention conditions in the mine and very tough companies. So those are the first victims of coal mining. And the rest of us are victims in that it is a huge piece of the global warming pie, and it is the perhaps most expensive form of electricity if you look at it in the long term. If you look at poor health, poorly paid workers, if you look at bad health for workers, habitat, climate, it's horribly expensive.
And bad health for you and me.
Bad health for everything and everyone. When I was at Greenpeace, I actually was apoplectic. Every time I would read in the paper, well, in our energy mix, but coal is a cheap energy, people in the office would be saying, oh, here comes Amy, because I was so mad. It's not cheap. And I said to my boss at the time, I want to know what a kilowatt hour of coal costs. I got to find out. Give me some money to do some research. And she did. And we then ended up working for the next 2 years with Harvard's Institute of Global Health and the Environment and created the full cost accounting life cycle of coal, which showed that conservatively, coal is twice as much money as we pay in its real costs than what we pay for retail up to 3 times as expensive. So we did a very long, rigorous, arduous process of doing our best guess of what a kilowatt hour of coal really costs. And instead of 8 cents an hour, which is what the retail cost is in the United States, it's more like between 16 and 27 cents per kilowatt hour if you actually charge the impacts.
So how do you do that? Well, number one, how do you account for it? Because that, you've done a very extensive research job just
It was
to find
difficult.
out. Yeah.
It was really, really difficult.
So you're having to account for the impacts over a huge area and also for a long period of time, right?
Well, we looked at extraction, we looked at combustion, we looked at water impacts, waste impacts, boom and bust cycles. It was truly difficult. And interestingly, the US Congress had, this was a global study, but most of what we did was in the United States. So we did some global numbers, but we really based it on US. The US Congress had commissioned the National Academy of Sciences to tell them the real cost of coal. And they had given them $500,000 to do this, which is not enough money. So, of course, we did it for much less, but that's because we had the institution of Harvard behind us, as well as Greenpeace staff. And we used what the National Academy of Sciences had begun. It was going down to a granular level. For example, in Kentucky, where coal is king, there's a local economic development organization, the Mountain Area Community Economic Development Group, MESED. They had looked at the state budget of Kentucky. And in the state budget of Kentucky, they saw that it says that it makes $110 million a year from coal. But in fact, it loses $110 million if you count the subsidies the state pays in direct subsidies to the businesses and indirect subsidies by paying for the health care of stricken workers, the boom and bust cycles, which are deadly for regions, the problem with water pollution, the problem with kids sick from coal poisoning, from local air and water pollution poisoning. Kentucky loses money. So everything is how you count it. And I think this relates to our worldview that is really the worldview that I work to change in my life. That is the view of what is profitable for a business has to include the consequences of what the business produces, from production to usage to disposal. That is not how we count. That is not how we account. So KPMG, the accounting firm, did a study about 5 years ago, and they looked at the 3,000 largest publicly traded corporations in the world. They measured $2.15 trillion of damage caused by just these 3,000 corporations. And that's environmental damage. So what was the profits of those 3,000 companies? I don't know, I haven't added it up. But one of the reasons why I think this was extraordinary is not only the number, but the fact that KPMG as a company had the willingness to antagonize huge numbers of its clients. So for me, I've decided to look at that information as a harbinger of what big companies can do. They did this without any, on their own, of their own accord. They publicized it. And there is no doubt that a lot of their clients got really mad. no doubt.
Now let me make sure I've got this straight. So $2.3 trillion?
I believe it's 2.15 trillion.
Yeah. And which are additional costs to what's actually reported in the company's books, right?
Right. Well, these are costs that were socialized across the world, whether it be a river in China where the textile dye is poisoning it, whether it be climate change globally, whether it be oil spills somewhere, whether it be having to build new energy, new electricity plants because of high use of electricity, whether it be waste, whether it be leaching of toxic chemicals, whether it be children going through toxic waste dumps to reclaim things and getting sick, whether it be educational costs, you name it.
Yeah. Now, if you take that and offset it, and I think this is what you said that was the piece that you hadn't done yet, but if you set that off against the profits, presumably those profits, at the very least, diminish sharply. And possibly disappear.
Well, 2.15 trillion is probably not going to disappear 3,000 publicly traded companies.
No, probably not.
No.
But I bet you there's companies.
Oh, it'll make a dent, and for some of them, it'll make a big dent.
Well, yeah, actually, I'm thinking of something of a set of interviews that we did about a pulp mill here in Nova Scotia, and by the time you count all the subsidies and the various losses that don't get counted, I question very much whether the existence of that pulp mill over a 50-year period didn't impoverish rather than
I think
enrich
that
this
is what we don't count right. So short-term profits are great. Hey, I like having money. I love having money. It buys stuff and experiences, and it's easier and fun when you don't have to worry about a roof over your head and food on your table. I'm for money. I'm not against money. It's, who doesn't like having it? What I am not for is money that is pretend cheap. I don't want to buy a t-shirt if it means that a child was a slave to make it. I don't want to buy a $5 t-shirt if it means that a region cannot drink their water. I don't want to buy a $5 t-shirt if it falls apart in 5 wearings and then I have to buy another one, and all of the materials and all of the manufacturing costs and all of the energy are gone to waste because it didn't last. Literally,
it's gone to the dump.
That's right, because it didn't last long enough. That's not a good investment. I would rather buy a $25 t-shirt, take care of it, have it be cleanly manufactured, and I don't think the t-shirt's going to have to cost $25.
You worked in Italy.
I did.
And a colleague of yours at some point, I think before you went, told you something about the way Italian would approach that.
So actually, this was before I moved to Italy. I was in a store in New York and I was buying dual voltage stereo. So I would have a stereo over there that I didn't actually, so I wouldn't have to buy a stereo that I could only use there. So I bought the dual voltage stereo, and the salesman was an Italian. And as with all Italians, they want to tell you something, always. And he said to me, the difference between Americans and Italians. Americans will buy a pair of pants for $20. They'll look terrible, they won't hang well, they'll be a bad material, he or she won't take care of them, and after 10 wearings, they will throw them out because they were a piece of crap. An Italian will buy one pair of pants for $200. They will be beautiful. They will hang well. The material will be something you want to touch a lot. They will take care of them, and you will wear them for 20 years. And the one pair at $200 will be worth more than the 10 pair at 20. And I think that that is the perfect view of accounting. That I want to buy things, as I said, I'm all for money. And I would like to buy things that have value, that were made by people who are not slaves, that do not destroy the earth, that I can dispose of in a long time or even pass on. That to me is good value. I think that just as people who we hear of who were poorer want to conserve their materials, conserve things, people want to take care because things are valuable. Money is not disposable.
Let me ask you if they do want that, because it seems to me one of the really weird things about the world we live in is that we have been trained to think that these things should be constantly changing. You know, so that we have like a disposable lifestyle. But if you go and buy that pair of pants for $200, you know, and now all of a sudden the style changes to bell bottoms, you know, or because I've lived long enough now that I've seen the pant cuffs come in and go out and come in and go out, and the knees come in and go out, come in and go out. You know, all that stuff changes, and that's not accidental. That's a marketing.
That is absolutely the case, but I think that for good Italian fashion, never goes out of style.
Yeah.
Not ever.
So now we're back to culture and design and beauty and those kinds of things,
well, you know,
right?
the biggest thing that I learned when I lived in Italy, I lived there for 2 years. It was an extraordinary experience, and when I moved back to the States, I really had this epiphany that in the United States, our culture, and I would say this is in most of North America, and unfortunately most of Europe now also, fast, efficient, and cheap is the mantra for what you want to produce. And I am much more interested in complexity, beauty, value. And
well, fast, efficient, cheap, and disposable.
And disposable,
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I don't want that. You know, one of the other things, and all of this has changed a lot in Italy. When I lived there, they wouldn't serve you to-go cups because they said if you can't afford, if you don't have time to stand up and drink a cup of coffee, maybe you shouldn't have it. You know, there was a different view of time and pleasure, and when you take time, I'm not recommending the Italian work ethic as a way for a global economy to function. They're not doing so well. But I think the values of beauty, complexity, and attention to detail is not something we should dispose of. It is something we should treasure and incorporate. You know, I think, you think back of people who built great skyscrapers. You know, they'll walk down, I built that. You know, I want somebody who creates a car or a pair of pants or a blender, you know, to be able to say, I built that. And I want, as a consumer, to have the respect for the worker, the material, the product, and the money that I will use this with value. I will use this with respect.
Now, we started with accounting, and now we've gotten to culture and design and long-term value and durability and so forth, which is a voyage that's in the exact opposite direction from what the corporate world has been doing for the last 50 or 60 or more years.
It is.
And you go into companies in your professional life and you basically try to make that change, to make that company think again about what it's doing and what its values are and where it's going. But from the corporate point of view, when the only value is the quarterly report, how do you do that? Because that's really, we can all agree on what should be done, but you're the person that's actually trying to do it at the key point.
I think that there's a whole bunch of factors that go into this. The first one is there are a lot of people in companies who don't want to be bad. Like, what is the first thing Google said? We don't want to be evil, or there was some mantra that is their first their primary directive. There's a lot of people in companies that would like to change their companies. There are now a lot of investors pushing companies to change. There are a lot of consumers pushing companies to change. There are a lot of activists pushing companies to change. And there is some realistic, the problems that are hitting companies at this point are so intense, and the environmental problems, that they almost have no option but to change. So I was at the Greenpeace office in Amsterdam once with executives from a very, very big, iconic company, a very big brand. And they use a lot of water for their products. And I brought into our meeting someone who is the head of toxic campaigns for Greenpeace internationally. And she asked the perfect question of of a senior VP. When you are downstream from a company that is polluting, and you then have to spend a huge amount of money to clean the water, do you think of yourselves as a victim of their pollution? Do you think of the expense you have to pay as a victim of their pollution? And the corporate executives, all of them, or a bunch of them in the room, they all went, I never thought of it that way. But now, globally, the issue of climate change is screwing up agriculture globally. It is screwing up shipping globally. It is screwing up production globally. It is destabilizing civilization. So there's a huge push now amongst corporations to become 100% renewable. And in fact, there's a bandwagon and momentum building because they're scared. You talk to any, I don't go in and have some magic formula. I go in and say, let me look at your product line. Let me look at what you're sourcing. Let me look at what you're manufacturing. Is any of this safe in the current environmental circumstances? Can you get your commodities? No. Can you predict what they're going to cost? No. Can you be sure that your factories are going to be safe if they're near a coastline? No. Can you be sure you're going to be able to get water? No. So how about changing everything so that you are part of the solution? At that point, where they're screwed if they don't make the change, it's a much easier discussion. And just going back to the accounting for a second, I was with head of sustainability for Pepsi, I don't know, 6 years ago maybe. Not quite, I don't know, recently. And he was talking about a factory that they had built in Arizona, and it was near net zero wastewater and energy. And he was telling me they kind of cracked a whole bunch of codes in their factory. And he was telling me about the design, and I was really impressed because it was impressive what they did. And I said, and this guy's a conservative Republican. And I said, so are you telling, so I presume now that you've done this, you're going to deploy all of that globally, right? Because that's amazing. And he said, well, you know, it costs a little more up front. And so it's going to harm our quarterly reports. And it might take 3 years before we get paid back. And we are so under the gun with Wall Street. We may not be, we're going to pick and choose what we're going to deploy globally. And when he said this, I just went into sort of a rage. Because this is exactly what's wrong. Now, if anybody doesn't think we need to be near net zero wastewater and energy in Arizona and everywhere else in the world, they're living in another universe, which is, I think, where Wall Street is living.
So how do you change that? Now, this is a wonderful example, isn't it? You've got a guy who's done the right thing, knows it's the right thing, knows how to do it.
And wants to do, and a company that wants to do the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they're doing some of it, but they want to do all of it. And the way that accounting works now, they are not rewarded for doing all of it. And this is the other thing. So because I work with so many companies, and so many of them tell Wall Street about something they've done that they are very proud of, that took them a lot of energy and mind and muscle and money. And they say Wall Street will never, ever ask them, what did you, how'd you do that? Why'd you do that? Who are you doing it with? Who else is doing it? Nothing. It is as if it is not in the short-term quarterly report gestalt.
So then it's not real, in a sense.
It's not real. And this is, to me, the next place to change the world.
So what do you do there at that point?
Well, I think, honestly, I think there is no courage amongst most of the world's governments. I think that big companies, and there are quite a few of them, that are organizing and ready to advocate for changing the rules. And they will, and some of the most profitable, high-value, iconic companies are ready to go to both government and to Wall Street to change the rules so that good environmental standards become incorporated, further incorporated and further embedded and integrated into accounting and what is profit and loss. It is, I think, going to have to be the corporations that are going to move the government, because the government, at least in my country, doesn't listen to the people very well unless they have a lot of money. So these companies, many of them, whether it be for self-interest or noble reasons, I don't care why. I have no claim on any moral authority. Whatever the reason, vested interest is a great reason. Advocate for the good.
You're portraying a corporate world here that would be unfamiliar, I think, to most people. Almost.
It's very few companies at the moment.
Well, it has a slightly Martian quality to it, But on the other hand, it must be fairly widespread, or you wouldn't have KPMG doing that kind of report. If they didn't understand there was something in the zeitgeist that was going to require this kind of...
There is definitely something in the zeitgeist. It is not enough companies. And but it is moving. So, for example, currently, utilities only make money when they charge for electricity. But it is in all of our advantage that utilities work with consumers and businesses to decentralize energy so that more people have solar arrays and geothermal and thermostats, so that the utilities don't have to build new power plants. It is in everyone's interest. So that means you got to change the utilities' business model, because you can't have them fighting, and the truth is you need them to keep the lights on. So I think it's not, there is no fantasy who's going to keep the lights on. They are. But the truth is, each of us could eliminate probably 20% of the energy we use fairly easily, and perhaps gather some more of it through some kind of distributed energy system. There are a few utilities fighting like the devil against all the distributed energy movement, and there is a movement on that, and that is human power, people, and some businesses. And then there's a few utilities who are stepping up, working with their local government, going, we absolutely have to change this. You have to help us figure out how to stay in business, keep the lights on, and encourage people to use more distributed energy. That's the businesses that will survive.
And they've somehow got to figure out a way that it's profitable for them if I save energy.
Yes.
Right?
That's a whole new business model.
That is, isn't it?
Yes.
That's quite revolutionary.
It is revolutionary, but that's the same idea that right now it's going back to. You pay 8 cents a kilowatt hour about for coal energy, even though it's costing anywhere between 16 and 27 cents a kilowatt hour for society. How about if we take those external costs and move them so that the incentive is there to pay the real value of energy when you use it, and to encourage everyone, including the utilities, to move towards distributed energy. It's a new business model.
Now, if you do that, if you say, okay, coal's now going to cost, let's say, 23 cents a kilowatt hour, the coal company now has a lot more money, but the people who are suffering from black lung disease don't have the benefit.
The truth is, they don't have more money, because that money, in other words, it's not that you give it to them. You pay for the health care. It's not, you're not giving them money.
Okay, so now we are now talking about a carbon tax or something equivalent to that, right? So
yes.
we're charging them up front, but that's not, that money is going into the general social welfare.
Correct.
And not into the pockets of
And at that point, we have to incentivize what is common sense. It's not like, oh, it's so surprising, we'd all be better off if there's more wind and solar and geothermal and small hydro and micro turbines, and people could, you know, plug in their cars at night, and, you know, all those things. It's not rocket science. It's not some grand idea. It's fairly straightforward.
But there is this huge resistance to it. And,
Yes.
and how do we get, number one, where does that come from? And number two, how do we get around it?
Is that all you want to know?
That's all I want to know.
I think the resistance to it goes back to what I said earlier. We all have a worldview. The worldview that we each cleave to is, of course, utter nonsense, but it's the worldview we cleave to. And so for anyone who's traveled anywhere, you know that, oh, I guess one of the great things about travel is that you realize, oh, how I eat, sleep, dress, court, mate, procreate, you know, raise kids, educate, think about food, sleep, you know, build stuff, is all cultural. And the same goes for our view of business models today. Today it's global, short-term, fast. How we change that view is lots and lots of activists in every kind of arena pushing for the change. So organic food began a movement, I don't know, 25 years ago maybe?
More,
okay.
It was going on in New Brunswick when I was teaching there in 1968.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there you go. So organic food for 50 years or so has been, begun a movement. Well, now Walmart buys billions of dollars of organic food every year to sell to its customers because it had to. I think that organic food is now understood in most ways to, it is still a small piece of the pie, but it is gaining position. That's a change. There is a whole food revolution that, thank you millennials, have really cemented in that they are standing and creating a whole new food paradigm. What you eat, how you eat, where it comes from. it's amazing. The young people who are working as farmers are changing the world, and it is global, and it is notable, and it's amazing. It is still a teeny piece of the puzzle, but at some point, this is how culture changes. You know, it's here, we have a perfect thing globally, marriage equality. You know, it's like millennials really don't care what your color is, what your sexuality is. It's really been a change in that generation. And guess what? You know, gay people can get married in lots of countries in the world. Doesn't mean that people in Kentucky are going to turn around and give them marriage licenses and behave with civility, or some of them won't.
Not yet.
Not yet, but clearly their kids, their cousins, their brother-in-laws are telling them, bad. You know, it's a change. It is that's how things change. They change by activists being noisy and pushy and working hard and pushing against things. And I actually think that the biggest change is going to happen, though, because of the environmental situation we're in. I don't think anybody thinks we're getting out of this free.
You know, it's interesting how much denial there is, though, all the same.
Yes.
Because, I mean, someone with your perspective looks out there and sees connections. But those connections are invisible to large numbers of people, and that's because it's in the interests of corporate power to keep them in ignorance about the connections.
So here's something interesting. I am putting a presentation together now for a very big company. And I went back and I looked at magazine covers over the past decade on global warming. And all the information, it's all there. I think that the denial is a combination of vested interest. I want my money, I want my oil, I want my big car, I want my big company, I want my big profits, I want. So some of that's largely from the corporate end. But I don't think consumers are, I think consumers are an equal accomplice. I think that I want to travel. I want to buy stuff. I want to eat well. I want a new dress. You know, I am old enough so I probably never need to buy anything ever again. And so I don't buy very much at all anymore because I don't need anything. I don't want anything. But for people who are in places that are just getting money now, who the hell are we to say, well, you know, you really don't need a new car, refrigerator, house, computer, entertainment. Who are we to say you shouldn't have that? And that's the place where most corporations are looking for their new markets. And all those people want all the stuff that we have. And I honestly think that the most difficult, intractable, hard place where the rubber meets the road, I think, is in places that are just getting disposable income now.
Places that are literally developing.
Yes.
You know, but on the other hand, it seems to me that the trajectory from getting into that kind of an economy and having those kinds of opportunities to the point where it's a problem is very short. I mean, like it used to be long, right? But in China, you know, when I was in China in 1976, the last year of Mao's life, and one of my most vivid memories is eating in a restaurant in what was then called Peking, and hearing through the window this lovely chiming sound on the breeze, and it was bicycle bells. The whole street was full of bicycles, right? That's not Beijing today, but Beijing today is having trouble breathing, and they didn't have it then.
Yes.
So there's obviously a circle to be squared, and it comes up very fast.
Very fast. You know, I last year or 2 years ago, I did some consulting with the OECD on green growth in Southeast Asia. And as I looked at all the data that this great research institution had developed, it was clear the costs of their new money are the mangroves are all dying because of shrimp farming and increased water temperature, and therefore they have floods. The Thai floods of 2009, or 2006, I'm not sure the year, completely devastated the country. And the real culprit was deforestation. So you could say, maybe, maybe not, the typhoon that caused the floods was climate enhanced. You'll never know. But you do know that it became a cataclysmic flood that basically shut down the country for 6 months because there was huge tracts of land that had been deforested. There was no soil left to hold the water. So the really interesting thing is, in addition to it devastating Thailand, Toyota lost 2.5% of its annual output because it couldn't get the parts that were produced in the factories in Thailand. And so, in addition to Toyota losing money, there were workers out of work in Kentucky, Singapore, and the Philippines because the factories that made the parts in Thailand weren't shipping the factory. So the kind of connection of global commerce to decades before. Most of that deforestation had happened 10, 20 years before. So what should those logs have cost? This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about accounting. Those logs caused a cataclysm for a nation in Southeast Asia, which caused economic devastation globally and to a few multinational corporations. And they took those logs for nothing. Not nothing, but very little. That's the bad accounting. That's the change that has to happen. And already in Southeast Asia today, my conclusion for them was there is no such thing as green growth. There is only green growth if the other growth is dirty growth, dangerous growth, short-term growth. You have to put those things together, and exactly as you say, it's coming up quickly. You can't breathe in many cities in Asia of all kinds. You can't get water in Sao Paulo because of extreme drought. You can't.
How do you do that accounting? Now let's turn the clock back to the point where there's now presumably corporate interests looking at the forests in Thailand, and they're saying, well, we're going to cut this down. How do you build into the pricing of that logging enterprise the impacts that we've seen that it's subsequently going to have?
Well, so I think it's not only building it in there, it's the whole chain. So first of all, if you're going to go log and you're going to clear cut, you should be on the hook until the clear cutting impacts start setting in. So that clear cutting will probably lose a mountainside into a stream, which will affect fish, etc., and will potentially cause something like the Thai flood catastrophe. If you do sustainable harvesting, where you don't destroy habitat, you don't destroy soil, you have ecosystems intact, you have wood that is more expensive, and so going on up the chain, we do not have disposable products made of wood. Wood is valuable. Water is valuable. Land is valuable. Air is valuable. It is all priced into the goods. Now, again, this goes to the real difficulty for places, you and I grew up, everything we bought was cheap. So now, if I'm in Thailand, you're going to say, so now you're going to tell me it's not going to be cheap? this is not fair. And so I think that this is why there's something called the Green Climate Fund in the United Nations treaty that's being negotiated for in December in Paris. Those of us who have benefited for having cheap stuff, lifestyles where we basically got rich quick and easy, are going to have to pay to subsidize. Other people paying more for the things that we have. I don't see another way around it, nor does anybody else.
Okay, so it's, in effect, it's got to be a tax scheme that affects the consumers in developed countries to create funds in international hands to be used to compensate for the damage and perhaps also for the very steep pricing of stuff in the developing world. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, so for all of China's emissions, which I believe it's the biggest emitter in the world now, none of the extreme weather and climate impacts that we're seeing, most of it is not caused by China. China's impact is baked into the future. Most of that has not been felt yet. Some of it has, but most of it not. Most of it is from the United States, Canada, Europe, some of South America. But it's mostly the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, Japan. We are the cause of my friend Kathy in the Marshall Islands having to relocate. We are the cause of hundreds of millions of Bangladeshis going to have to move. We are the cause of droughts, wildfires, heat waves. Last week in Spain, it was 50 degrees. We are the reason for that. We now have to pay. There is no way around it. We have to pay.
But we also have, this is such a big, messy subject, right? Or a series of subjects, or interlocking circles of subjects. But one thing that we've touched on, and I want to go back to a little bit, is going forward from here. We obviously have to stop doing some of the things that we've been doing as part of that, and start doing it differently. And one I wanted to mention was the whole business of Wall Street and the quarterly reports and the reward for short-term thinking. But you've got some examples of companies that have simply said, we're not going to do quarterly reports.
Unilever won't do quarterly reports anymore. But I think, and there is an organization called the B Team, which is organizing, it is corporate leaders. It's Richard Branson, Jochen Zeitz of Puma and Kering, Arianna Huffington, Paul Polman of Unilever, big CEOs of big multinationals are hoping to create the business model for the 21st century that includes people, planet, and profit. So these are the companies, these are the people who are going to change the zeitgeist.
These are real leaders.
Oh yeah,
I mean, they're leaders anyway.
These are household names.
Yeah, yeah. So they're.
Oh, and actually, Ratan Tata is in there. It's I can't say his name right. One of the largest cell phone entrepreneur in Africa. Oh. Yeah, no, it's a global group, and it's not big enough yet. But they are They have a very important message. I think actually, there's something called risky business, which you probably know about. Do you know about that?
The phrase is familiar.
Risky business was created by Tom Steyer, a billionaire hedge fund, Michael Bloomberg, a billionaire.
Former mayor. You're a former mayor.
Former mayor of New York, and creator of Bloomberg. I don't know, Bloomberg Networks or
Bloomberg Information Systems.
Yes,
in
whatever
many
it's
formats.
called.
Yeah,
I don't know the full name. And Hank Paulson, who is the former Treasury Secretary of the U.S. and the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. They created something called Risky Business, which is a research piece and an advocacy group to show the real cost of climate change. And they have brought in globally, military leaders, secretaries of state, defense, cabinet ministers, secretaries from around the world, and done op-eds in a lot of media showing, and I mean, talk about, these people know Wall Street. But Wall Street, even though they are obviously king, they are titans of Wall Street. Wall Street has not heeded them as they should. But they're, it hasn't stopped them at all. And all of them are working actively. And I'm very happy to say that Michael Bloomberg is the co-chair of the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. So he is looking to change the accounting.
Which brings us back to that whole issue of
It
accounting,
does.
right?
We've come full circle.
And it so often comes, but the what I've been calling fairy tale accounting, changing that to sustainable accounting is a wonderful, or full cost accounting we've also been calling it.
Yeah.
But getting it in place is really a task,
Killer.
isn't it?
It's a big task, and there are global organizations, the Global Reporting Initiative, Integrated Reporting, the Prince Charles Trust, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. There's an alphabet soup of organizations. All of it is difficult. All of it is complicated. It is, all of these groups are looking to create something, a life cycle assessment, to show the real cost of goods. Because in accounting, one of the first top lines is cost of goods sold. And right now, that does not include the impacts of the cost of goods sold. Changing that is the key. It's one of these keys. So there are a few changes that could make a big difference. So for example, accelerated depreciation for green infrastructure investments. Every time Pepsi wants to build a smart, fabulous factory, if you accelerated the depreciation on the extra amount that it costs them to go green, they would do it everywhere in 1 second, as would everyone else, because you eliminate the issue of, well, it'll cost us a little more money and da-da-da-da. It's not so complicated. I think that the difficulty of the current attempts to change accounting standards is that it is looking at the whole picture. And as we know, trying to change the tax code or trying to change business accounting, really, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. It's a really hard job. That's a really hard job. Whereas there are a few rules that could make the change that you're looking for quickly, and then it would be easier to make the changes on the bigger pieces.
The really hopeful thing, it seems to me, and what you are revealing to us here, is that these changes are actually underway, and that there are enough people at senior levels who are really interested in seeing this go forward and who are kind of realistic about it. And it's clear that little people beating on the wall from outside aren't going to have nearly the impact of a handful of people on the inside.
I think, first of all, I don't want to give a fairy tale view. We are not even close to where we have to be to protect our planet. Right. So I want no fantasy. I want to give no misdirection. What we have to do is, pole vault over the Himalayas in terms of changes. I think that there are amazing business leaders everywhere you look. But I think that the status quo of business profits of the stock market are so entrenched, and the interest from the next billion people becoming middle class who want all the stuff that we have, and they deserve it, is huge. So I really hope that I am hopeful because I am working with and cajoling and hopefully collaborating with people willing to radically collaborate and change their businesses for whatever reason. So I have hope because those are the people who choose to move forward, and more of them are. But I think I have no fantasy that the status quo has to change in a way, and a huge piece of it is the cultural view of money. It's easy. I deserve a $5 t-shirt. No, you don't. I deserve a $2,000 car. No, you don't. I deserve cheap energy. You don't. And that's very hard to hear, and there are no politicians willing to say that. No, you want to drive around in an SUV? That's fine. You can pay for XYZ. Or you can pay XYZ every time you buy gas.
I agree. I mean, the overall outlook is pretty dark, but the problem, I guess, if you don't see points of light, and that's really what you're showing
I
us,
see
right?
points of light everywhere.
Yeah, and that's really important.
You know, and that allows me to get up every day, read the news.
And that's why I wanted to do this interview, right?
There you go.
Because whoever is going to watch this interview is going to get that sense of, oh, it's not just totally hopeless. Oh, the corporate world is not monolithic.
No, it isn't at all.
Right?
Not at all. Yeah. You know, when the U.S. Chamber of Commerce fought the Waxman-Markey climate bill in 2009, Apple, Johnson & Johnson, a whole bunch of companies left the Coca-Cola. A whole bunch of them said, you do not speak for us. There is a schism in the business world, and actually, I think it needs to get stronger and sharper because there are so many companies willing to step up and step out and say, we are going to fight for our planet because it's good business. And those companies that don't, may they rest in peace.
Amy Larkin, the environmental advisor who works inside the boardroom. If you're also concerned about full cost accounting and responsible corporate behavior, you'll probably enjoy our interviews with corporate critic David Korten, Patagonia founder Yvon Chouinard, and the Honorable Jigme Thinley, the former Prime Minister of Bhutan. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.